When the rangers found the old man collapsed alone in the forest, they had no idea that a 200-kilogram silverback gorilla was already watching from the trees. And when Makonde was rushed to the hospital, his heart failing, his body shutting down, no one noticed that Casey had stopped eating. He sat at the edge of his territory facing the direction of the compound, and waited. What happened over the next 4 days would leave scientists speechless, and change everything they thought they knew about the bond between humans and gorillas.
Before watching, subscribe for more touching stories like these. And I'm curious, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is.
Joseph Makonde had given 51 years of his life to this forest. Every morning, before sunrise, the same worn green jacket, the same rutted red dirt road, the same animals waiting. And on that Tuesday morning in March, he drove out alone, the way he always did. He never came back. It was a trail of blood that led him there 15 years earlier, 2 kilometers into the forest, following broken branches and disturbed earth, until he heard it, a sound he would never forget. Low, rhythmic, the sound of a large animal that has been fighting for a long time and is beginning to lose. He pushed through the undergrowth and stopped. A young silverback, newly dominant, barely 5 years into his leadership, was sitting against a tree with his left arm extended at an unnatural angle. A wire snare had cut through the flesh nearly to the bone. He had been pulling against it for hours. The ground around him was torn up where he had struggled. Even from 10 meters away, Makonde could smell the infection. Casey heard him and reacted instantly. A sharp explosive bark, a lunge forward that the snare cut short. He hit the ground hard, lay there, breathing in ragged gasps. Makonde froze. He radioed for the veterinary team. Then he sat down, in the mud, and stayed there. He didn't approach, just sat, spoke quietly, and let the animal hear a calm, human voice in the worst moment of his life. The forest darkened around them. Hours passed. At some point deep in the night, something changed. Casey's breathing slowed. His massive shoulders dropped half an inch. He lowered his head. Not in defeat, in trust. Makonde felt it happen and didn't move a muscle. He sat there for 22 hours without sleeping. When it was over, when Casey was finally released back into the forest 3 weeks later, he stood at the edge of the trees and turned back one last time. It was Makonde's face he looked at before disappearing into the green. 15 years had passed since that night. The bond had never broken. The tracking teams had a standing note in their field reports. When Makonde is present, Casey remains calm. Approach distances reduced by approximately 40%. Casey trusted him. Completely. In a way, he trusted almost no one else. That Tuesday morning, Makonde drove alone to the eastern ridge where Casey's group had been spotted the day before. He parked on the service road and walked the last kilometer on foot, the way he always did. He had not been well for weeks. Fatigue, chest heaviness. His daughter had begged him to see a cardiologist. His colleagues had noticed him stopping more often than usual. He waved everyone off. Old bones, he'd say. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix. He found Casey's group in a clearing near the wild fig trees. He lowered himself onto a fallen log, opened his notebook, wrote a few lines. Then his pen dropped to the forest floor. He pressed a hand to his chest. His vision blurred. The trees tilted. The sounds of the forest became strange and distant. He tried to call out, couldn't. He slid from the log into the undergrowth and did not get up. The notebook lay open beside him, the last line unfinished. And from the pocket of his worn green jacket, a small photograph had fallen face up into the grass. Amina, maybe 7 years old, sitting on his shoulders at the edge of the forest, both of them laughing. 2 rangers, David and Amara, were on a trail survey 400 meters away when the GPS alert triggered on Makonde's personal tracker. No movement detected for 12 minutes. They ran. They found him unconscious in the undergrowth, face pale, breathing in shallow, irregular gasps. David dropped to his knees and checked his pulse. Weak. Dangerously erratic. "Medics. Now," he said. The emergency team arrived within 20 minutes and rushed him to the reserve's medical station, then immediately transferred him by vehicle to the regional hospital in Kabylie, 40 kilometers away on rough mountain roads. David rode with him the entire way, holding his hand, calling his name. At the hospital, the doctors worked quickly. Severe cardiac event. Significant damage to the heart muscle. He was alive, but barely. The lead physician pulled David aside in the hallway. "He's stable for now," she said carefully. "But the next 48 hours are critical. His heart has been under serious strain for some time. He should never have been working in those conditions." David walked outside and stood in the parking lot for a long time. Then he called the reserve and gave them the news. Amina arrived 6 hours after the call. She walked straight past David in the corridor and pushed open the door to her father's room. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The machines, the tubes, the pale, still face of the man who had never, not once in her entire life, allowed himself to look fragile. She sat down and took his hand. "I told you," she whispered, not in anger. In the quiet devastation of someone who had been right about something they desperately wished they'd been wrong about. She had called him every week for 2 months. "Go to the doctor, Baba, just once." He had laughed it off, every time. Old bones, Amina, nothing to worry about. She sat beside him through the night and talked, about the forest, about the morning drives when she was small, waking before dawn and watching the animals emerge from the dark as the sun came up. His breathing steadied slightly when she talked about the forest. Even now, even here. On the third morning, the doctor came in and spoke quietly. The damage was more extensive than the scans had shown. A second cardiac event had occurred overnight. "We're doing everything we can," he said, "but you should prepare yourself." Amina nodded. She looked at her father's face, then out the window at the gray, early sky, and found herself thinking, irrationally, desperately, that somewhere out there the forest already knew. Back at Bwindi, the mood shifted the moment word spread. Rangers moved quietly. Conversations dropped to murmurs. The normal rhythm of the reserve, the radio chatter, the laughter, the boots on, gravel, all of it softened, as if the forest itself had heard. But something else happened that no one noticed at first. The tracking team assigned to Group 7 filed an unusual report that evening. Kessie had not moved from the Eastern Ridge clearing all day. That alone was not extraordinary. Silverbacks rest for long periods. But what the trackers described was different. He wasn't resting. He was sitting upright, facing west, the direction of the main compound and the road to Cabal, and he had barely moved in 5 hours. He had not eaten. He had not interacted with his family. He was simply sitting, watching, waiting. The lead tracker, a young woman named Grace who had worked at the reserve for 4 years, wrote in her log, "Kessie behavioral anomaly. Possible stress response. Will monitor." The next morning, the report was the same. Still at the ridge, still facing west, still not eating. By the second morning, the senior research coordinator, Dr. Patricia Owens, a British primatologist who had studied Bwindi's gorillas for 11 years, drove out to see it for herself. She sat in the observation vehicle and watched Kessie for 2 hours. He didn't move. "Has anything disturbed the group?" she asked Grace. "Any poaching activity nearby? Any unusual sounds?" Grace shook her head. "Nothing. The forest has been completely quiet." Dr. Owens watched him for another 20 minutes. Then she said something quietly, almost to herself, that Grace would remember for the rest of her career. "He knows something is wrong." On the third day, David received the update by phone. He walked directly to the research office and found Dr. Owens reviewing the tracking data. "It's bad," he said. "They don't think he'll make it through another night." Dr. Owens looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked back at her screen, at the GPS dot sitting motionless on the eastern ridge for 3 days straight. "Casey still hasn't moved," she said quietly. David sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "How is that possible?" he said. "How does he know?" She had no answer. Joseph Makonde died at 4:47 in the morning on the 4th day. His daughter was holding his hand. The room was quiet. Outside the hospital window, the sky was just beginning to lighten. His heart, which had served him faithfully through 51 years in the forest, gave out. The call came to the reserve at 5:15 a.m. David took it. He stood with the phone in his hand for a long moment after the call ended, looking out the window at the dark shapes of the trees against the early sky. Then he walked outside and told the others. At 5:40 a.m., 25 minutes after the news reached the reserve, Grace radioed in from the eastern ridge. Her voice was shaking slightly. "Casey is moving," she said. "He's coming down from the ridge. He's heading toward the compound." Dr. Owens was already in her vehicle. She drove to the edge of the compound and waited. Casey emerged from the tree line alone at first light, without his family, which was almost unheard of for a silverback, and walked slowly toward the main gate, which had been left open for staff arriving for the morning shift. The rangers who saw him coming froze. One reached for his radio instinctively to call for backup. Dr. Owens held up her hand. "Wait," she said. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Casey walked through the gate. He moved through the compound with a slow, deliberate calm, past the vehicles, past the equipment shed, past the group of rangers standing completely still against the wall, and stopped in the center of the main courtyard. He looked around. Then, as if he already knew where to go, he turned toward the small memorial area at the edge of the courtyard. It was the bench where Makonde had spent every morning before his rounds, sitting with his notebook and his tea, watching the light change over the trees. It was also where he had written his very first field report on Casey 15 years ago, the morning after the snare. He walked to it. He stood there, and he lowered his head. A sound came from him then, low, resonant, a deep rumbling hum that vibrated in the chest of everyone who heard it. Primatologists call it a belch vocalization, a contact call used between family members when they are close and at peace. It is the sound gorillas make for one another. He held that position for nearly 8 minutes. No one in the courtyard spoke. No one moved. When Casey finally lifted his head, he looked, slowly, deliberately, at each face around him, as if he were acknowledging them, as if he were saying, "I know. I am here. We share this." Then he turned and walked back through the gate, and disappeared into the forest. The funeral was held 3 days later, in the grassy clearing at the edge of the forest where Makonde had loved to sit and write in his notebook. His family was there, his colleagues, community elders, researchers who had come from Kampala and from abroad when they heard. A simple stone was placed at the head of the grave, engraved with his name, the years of his service, and a line his daughter had chosen. He loved the forest, and the forest loved him back. As the last words of the ceremony were spoken and the group stood in silence around the grave, someone pointed. Casey was at the tree line, sitting alone, watching. He stayed until every person had left. Then he approached the grave slowly, alone. He placed one hand on the ground beside the stone, and was still. Amina watched from a few steps away. She had no more tears left. She simply stood and looked at this enormous, gentle animal, and understood, without words, that she was not the only one who had lost him. No one who was there ever forgot it. In the months that followed, the tracking teams updated their field reports. Kessie's group had shifted their core territory. Their new range now included the clearing where Makonde was buried. He was documented returning to the grave 11 times over the following 4 months. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with members of his family nearby, as if he had brought them to understand something he couldn't explain in any other way. Dr. Owens, who had studied Wendy's gorillas for 11 years, was careful with her language the way scientists are trained to be. But when asked privately what she truly believed, she said the same thing every time. He knew Makonde was dying before we did, and he came to say goodbye. David still visits the grave every week. He brings wild flowers, the same ones he watched Makonde pick absently from the roadside during their morning patrols. He talks to him about the forest, about the gorillas, about what stays the same. And sometimes, in the quiet of that clearing, he hears it. Far off in the trees, low, resonant, unmistakable. A sound made for family. Did this story touch your heart? And do you believe gorillas grieve just like we do? Write yes or no in the comments below, like this video, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.